I have filed 17 incident reports in my career. 11 of them were routine. 2 of them were embarrassing. 3 of them, my commanding officer told me to reword until they stopped sounding like what they actually were. This one I wrote 4 times. Not because command kept rejecting it, because I kept stopping halfway through and staring at the wall, trying to figure out how to explain, in language built for documenting orderly things, what I watched a 19-year-old human do in 13 seconds. 13 seconds. We have entire military academies that spend 4 annual cycles teaching our officers how to survive contact with an enemy force at close quarters. Doctrine, contingency protocols, weapons retention drills, exit strategy matrices. 13 seconds. I watch her burn through all of it. She didn't have doctrine. She had a split lip, a broken earpiece, and what I can only describe as a look on her face like someone had interrupted her during something she cared about. The Vethkai didn't laugh, exactly. Their vocal anatomy doesn't allow for it. But when our intelligence unit first presented them with human reflex data, the actual numbers, the neural transmission speeds, the musculature response curves, they made a sound. I have heard that sound described as dismissal. I have heard it described as contempt. What I know is this. 3 of the 6 Vethkai officers who made that sound are currently listed as missing from operational duty, and the other 3 stopped, making it approximately 8.7 seconds into those 13 seconds. I was there. I was the one holding a cold cup of something I generously call coffee and watching from a corridor I was not supposed to be in. And I still don't know how to file the report. So I'm starting here. The thing about Vethkai laughter is that it doesn't come from the throat. It comes from the chest cavity, a pressurized expulsion that sounds to my audio receptors like a cargo door seal failing. Repetitive, rhythmic, deeply unimpressed. I heard 4 of them doing it from 20 meters down the corridor when I should have already been in the briefing room, sitting in my assigned seat, pretending I had opinions about supply chain disruption vectors across the Nerith corridor. I was not in my assigned seat. I was standing in a hallway I had technically been cleared for, drinking something our ship's nutrition processor called bitter warming beverage, Terran analog, and deeply reconsidering my life. The beverage tasted like regret dissolved in hot water. I kept drinking it anyway. The mug was warm. The Vethkai were in lab observation room 7C. I knew this because I could hear them. I knew what they were looking at because I'd been the one to route the intelligence packet to their delegation. Reflex assessment data, standard pre-partnership evaluation, the kind of thing that takes 3 of my work cycles to compile and approximately 11 seconds for visiting dignitaries to dismiss. The packet was about humans. Specifically, it was about how fast humans react to physical threat. The data was, by any clinical measure, unimpressive. Compared to Vethkai neural architecture, a human's reflex arc runs something like 4 times slower. Their nerve conduction velocity is, and I had to write this sentence in the report without edging into what my first cycle instructor called unfortunate editorial tone, substantially below coalition average across all assessed species. The Vethkai saw the number. They made the sound. I took another sip of my beverage and stared at the corridor wall and tried to remember if I had submitted my personnel rotation request before or after the 3rd draft of this packet. It seemed important. It seemed like the kind of thing a person in control of their career would know. I did not know. What I did know, what everyone in the Auxiliary Intelligence Division knew, and very carefully did not put in official documentation, was that raw reflex speed was approximately the 47th most relevant thing about humans in a close-quarters engagement. The packet did not say this. The packet said what the data said. The data said, slow. What the data did not have a column for was the girl in sublevel 4. Her name was Vasquez. Corporal, 1st Human Auxiliary, one of 14 human personnel attached to Station Velnerith as part of the ongoing partnership evaluation. I had processed her transfer documents. I had filed her biometric entry credentials. I had at one point accidentally routed her dietary restriction form to the wrong administrative queue, and she had appeared at my workstation to correct this with a patience that was, I think, a specific kind of threat. She was 19 years old. This information was in her file. I had found it incomprehensible at the time, and found it increasingly incomprehensible as the situation in Sublevel 4 developed. She had been assigned to Equipment Inventory. Sublevel 4, Section 9. Crates of Coalition Standard Field Gear, a handheld scanner, and no one else. This last part was a scheduling error that would eventually appear in a separate report. She was not supposed to be alone. The Vethkai recalibration team was not supposed to be conducting field trials in that section until the following rotation cycle. Supposed was doing a great deal of work in this account. I found out about Sublevel 4 because Operator Keltaz, who monitors the environmental feeds for the station's lower levels, appeared at my workstation at approximately the third hour of the shift with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Keltaz has 4 facial configurations: neutral, mildly annoyed, deeply annoyed, and the specific look she gets when she's discovered a filing irregularity. This was a 5th one. "S-overrun," she said. "Do you have a moment?" It was not a question. I had my beverage. I followed her. The feed from Sublevel 4 to 9 was not live. There had been a sensor interruption during the incident, which I will explain, but the reconstruction from the pressure plates and the secondary thermal array was sufficient. I watched it 3 times before I said anything. "What?" I said, "is the timestamp on this?" "Entry event to resolution." Keltaz pointed at the counter in the lower corner of the reconstruction feed. "Total elapsed 13 seconds. That's..." I started. "Yes." But yes. I looked at the feed again. The thermal array wasn't high resolution. The pressure plate reconstruction was frankly a mess because whatever had happened in that room had involved a great deal of fast motion, and the reconstruction algorithm does not handle fast motion gracefully. There were artifacts. There were gaps. What was clear, even through the artifacts, was the beginning state. Vasquez, alone, scanner in hand, for Vethkai field operatives entering the section, and what the pressure data indicated was a tactical formation. And the ending state, 3 Vethkai operatives down on the floor. Non-fatally, I would confirm later, and the word non-fatally would prompt a very long silence from my commanding officer when I reported this, and one at the exit hatch, moving in a direction that the thermal imaging charitably described as rapidly departing. 13 seconds between those 2 states. I kept staring at the wall of the second state. "Her reflex data," I said, "is in the standard human assessment packet." "I know," Keltaz said. "The Vethkai delegation reviewed it this morning." "I know," Keltaz said. "They found it unimpressive." Keltaz made a sound. Not the Vethkai sound. Something quieter and more tired. "Yes," she said. "I imagine they did." I looked back at the reconstruction. The thermal signature for Vasquez, post-incident, showed her standing in the same section she'd started in. The scanner was still in her hand. The pressure plates registered a return to inventory behavior within approximately 40 seconds of the last contact point. She had gone back to counting crates. I thought about my personnel rotation request. I thought about the 4th draft of my reflex assessment packet. I finished my beverage. It tasted, somehow, worse than it had 20 minutes ago. I requested access to Sublevel 4 on a pretext so thin it was nearly translucent. Equipment maintenance verification. Cross-referencing the physical inventory against Vasquez's scanner logs, which were technically an intelligence concern because the sensor interruption during the incident had flagged the whole section for administrative review. This was all true. It was also true that I could have assigned this task to any of 4 subordinates, or simply reviewed the scanner logs remotely, or done nothing and let the section clear its flag automatically in 48 hours. I want myself. I told myself it was thoroughness. I'm a deeply unconvincing liar, including to myself. Vasquez was still there. This was, according to the duty roster, correct. She had an 8-hour inventory assignment. The incident had occurred in hour 3. She had 5 hours remaining, and she appeared to be serving them. She looked up when I entered, made the assessment that I was not a threat, and looked back down at her scanner. "Attaché," she said. Not a greeting. An identification. The way you'd say door when you saw a door. "Corporal." I held my datapad at what I hoped was a professional angle. Routine verification. The sensor interruption flagged this section for review. She scanned a crate. "Mark something. Move to the next one." I stood in the middle of the room and tried to look purposeful. The room looked like a room. Crates in rows. The overhead lighting, one panel on the far left, slightly off frequency. It had been doing that for 11 days, and I had put in a maintenance request, and the maintenance request was in a queue somewhere doing nothing. There were 4 places on the floor where the pressure plate sensors were slightly raised at the edges. An installation flaw, nothing serious. I had been in this room before. Everything in it was the same as it had been before. You're looking at the floor, Vasquez said. The sensor calibration, you're looking at where they came in. She didn't look up. Entry hatch is behind you. They came through it in a stack. First 2 went left, second 2 went right. Textbook brillage formation. I turned and looked at the hatch. I turned back. How did I stop? Restructured. The reconstruction suggests the initial contact was scanner picked up the pressure differential before the hatch finished cycling. She scanned another crate. 13 millimeter variance in the ambient pressure. Took about half a second. Half a second. The Vethkai breach formation, the specific one she had described, first 2 left, second 2 right, was designed to disorient targets through simultaneous lateral pressure. The idea was that no organism with forward-facing threat detection could process both flanks fast enough to mount an effective response. The idea had been developed over several centuries of Vethkai tactical doctrine. It assumed a specific response window. You noticed a 13 millimeter pressure differential, I said. I noticed pressure differentials. She moved to the next crate. Loud places. Small spaces. Anywhere I've been where someone opened something they weren't supposed to, or closed something that was supposed to stay open. A pause. Just the sound of her scanner. You notice things that have mattered before. I wrote nothing on my data pad. The reconstruction had shown me what happened. It had not shown me this part, the half second before, the thing that preceded the thing. The reconstruction started at contact. It did not start at the pressure differential that Vasquez had already processed, cataloged, and converted into an action plan while the hatch was still cycling. Our reflex data measured response time from stimulus to movement. It did not measure the interval before the stimulus. It did not have a column for what you do with half a second that most people don't notice they have. I was going to have to rewrite so much of that packet. The Vethkai delegation, I said carefully, reviewed the standard assessment data this morning. I know. Vasquez moved to the next row. Keltaz told me. I did not ask why Keltaz had told her. Keltaz operates on an information-sharing philosophy that periodically gives my commanding officer a migraine. They found the data. I searched for the right word. Unimpressive. Vasquez said it the same way she'd said attaché. Flat and accurate. Yeah, that's fine. It did not sound like it was fine. It sounded like something that had been said so many times it had stopped requiring a reaction. The incident this morning was a training accident. She met my eyes for the first time. That's what's going in the report. They came through the wrong hatch during a live recalibration exercise. Equipment damage resulted. No fatalities. A beat. That's what's going in the report. I looked at her. She looked at me. The Vethkai operatives, I said, have confirmed this account. 3 of them have. The 4th one I didn't catch before he left, but his team leader filed the confirmation, so she shrugged, went back to her scanner. It's fine. Training accident. Equipment damage. 3 Vethkai operatives with what the medical log I had also technically pulled described as blunt impact contusions. Non-critical, full recovery expected in 4 to 6 cycles. Training accident. I looked at the floor again, at the raised edges of the pressure plate sensors, at the off-frequency lighting panel on the left, at the slight scuff marks near the far crates that the reconstruction had flagged as movement artifact, low confidence. She had used the lighting. I understood, standing there, that she had used the lighting, drawn at least one of them toward the high contrast side while she and the pressure plates, she'd known exactly where the edges were. You know if you've been scanning that floor for 3 hours, you know every irregularity, 13 seconds. It wasn't reflexes. I mean, it had to be at some point, the body moving faster than thought. But it was built on 3 hours of standing in a room and knowing the room. On a half-second pressure differential. on a lighting flaw that had been in my maintenance queue for 11 days. My maintenance queue. I thought about this for a long moment. Corporal, I said, is there anything you need? From an equipment standpoint. For the remainder of your assignment. She looked up again. The assessment happened again, faster this time. The light on the left, she said. I'll escalate the maintenance request. Thanks. She went back to her crates. I went back to my datapad and wrote lighting panel, section 9, priority escalation in the notes field, which would do absolutely nothing because the maintenance queue had its own logic and its own timeline, and I had no actual authority over either. I stood there for another few seconds. Attaché. Vasquez, not looking up. You can go. I'm Fina. I went. I did not feel like I had verified anything. I felt like I had been shown a room I thought I understood and discovered it had 3 more walls. The Vethkai delegation left Velnerith 2 cycles later. The official reason was scheduling. Their evaluation itinerary had always included a departure at this point, and the incident in Sublevel 4 was a training accident, documented, confirmed, closed. There was nothing to delay them. I stood at the observation deck and watched their transport disengage from the docking ring, and I thought about the sound they had made in Lab Observation Room 7C when they saw the reflex numbers. The cargo door seal sound. Dismissal, my colleagues called it. I had agreed with them before. The 5th draft of the reflex assessment packet was a different document from the first 4. Not because the data changed. The data was the same. The numbers were the same. Human neural conduction velocity remained, in absolute terms, below coalition average. What changed was the framing. The first 4 drafts had started with the numbers because that's where intelligence assessments start, with what is measurable. You compile the measurements. You present the measurements. You draw conclusions from the measurements, and you do this carefully so that the conclusions do not outrun the data, which would be unscientific and embarrassing. The 5th draft started with a different question. What does reflex speed measure, and what does it fail to measure? It is a bad question for an intelligence document. My commanding officer was going to hate it. It had the faint smell of philosophy, which is the smell that makes senior officers start editing your work themselves, and senior officers who edit your work themselves are a category of problem I have spent my career avoiding. I wrote anyway. Here is what reflex speed measures. The time between a stimulus occurring and a body beginning to respond to it. Here is what it does not measure. The work that happens before the stimulus. Corporal Vasquez had 3 hours in that room before the Vethkai breach team came through the hatch. 3 hours in which she had, by her own account, learned the pressure differential of a cycling hatch, cataloged the exact dimensions of the sensor plate irregularities, and formed, somewhere in the part of her brain that runs quietly underneath the part that counts crates, a map of the room and everything in it that could be used, angled, or accounted for. When the hatch cycled, when a half-second pressure change happened, and her body registered it before the sound reached her ears before the visual appeared, she did not need to think. She had already thought. The 13-second counter I had stared at was measuring the wrong interval. The real interval started 3 hours earlier, with a girl alone in a room with a scanner and a malfunctioning light panel, and whatever it is that runs in the background of a human mind when a human in question has learned, through methods I don't have data on and will not speculate about in an official document, to treat every unfamiliar space as a problem to be solved before the problem announces itself. The Vethkai dismissal, the sound they made in 7C, the sound I had agreed to call contempt, was a response to a number. The number was real. The number was also measuring the wrong thing. I included a section in the 5th draft. I titled it Assessment Limitations because I was not prepared to title it What the Numbers Don't Tell You, which was more accurate, but would have produced a response from command that I did not have the emotional reserves for. In the Assessment Limitations section, I wrote about pre-stimulus processing. I wrote about environmental mapping. I wrote carefully about the difference between a slow reflex and a narrow window of action, and I noted, in language I spent approximately 40 minutes calibrating. The human personnel assigned to static or semi-static environments for extended periods prior to potential threat contact may perform in ways that raw response time metrics do not predict. It was the most restrained sentence I had written in my career. It was also the one I was most certain about. Vasquez was reassigned 3 days after the Vethkai departure. I did not route this transfer. I did not see the documentation until it had already processed. The transfer designation was 3rd Auxiliary Strike Group, Forward Operational Theater, which was not a place you sent people for administrative reasons. I did not know who had flagged her. I did not know if it was a reward or a removal. These two things, I was realizing, were not always distinguishable in military administration. I found her in the loading bay an hour before her transport left. I was technically there to hand-deliver a credentials update, which was a thing that could absolutely have been done digitally. Keltaz, who was standing near the bay entrance when I arrived, did not say anything about this. She handed me a cup of something hot and moved aside. Vasquez was checking her equipment. She had a specific way of doing it. I had watched enough footage at this point to recognize it as a pattern, touching each item in the same sequence, same order, same duration. Like a ritual. Like counting crates. Attaché, she said. Corporal. I held out the credentials chip. Transfer documentation. She took it without stopping her equipment check. Tucked it away. Kept going. 3rd Strike Group's a good assignment, she said. It had the rhythm of a thing she'd said before, to someone else, in a different bay on a different station. The rhythm of convincing. The forward theater is, I stopped. Yeah. She snapped a closure on her kit bag. I know what it is. I stood there. She finished the equipment check. Shouldered the bag. Your packet, she said. The Reflex 1. It's being revised. I heard. She turned. The assessment happened. Faster than it used to, I thought, or maybe I was just paying more attention now. Put something in there about boredom. Boredom. She adjusted the bag strap. 3 hours counting crates. You know what happens when a person gets bored in a small room? They learn the room. Not on purpose. Just, there's nothing else to look at. She glanced at the bay entrance, the loading pattern, the positions of the other personnel, the sight lines. All of it. A second. Maybe less. Put that in there. She walked toward the transport. I wrote boredom on my datapad. I stared at it. Boredom. 7 letters for the thing that turned 3 hours of inventory into a weapon system. The 5th draft of the packet was submitted 4 days later. Command sent it back with 11 edits. 9 of them were stylistic. One of them removed the assessment limitations section entirely and replaced it with a note that said see standard parameters. One of them, added by a senior officer I had never met, was a single line at the end of the document. Recommend continued monitoring of human personnel performance data. I read it 3 times. Continued monitoring. As if the monitoring had ever been the issue. As if the problem was that we hadn't been watching closely enough when the actual problem, the one I had tried to write 5 different ways, the one that kept sliding out from under clinical language, was that we had been watching for the wrong thing. We watched for the reflex. We missed the room. I filed the 5th draft. I made a 6th draft for myself in my personal log that I will not submit to anyone. In the 6th draft, the assessment limitations section is longer. It includes a subpoint I marked informal, not for documentation that says, the Vethkai assessment of human reflex data was accurate. The data was accurate. Both of these things are true, and both of them are irrelevant because the human in question had resolved the encounter in the 3 hours before it started. We measured how fast she could react. We forgot to ask what she'd been doing while she waited. The Vethkai transport entered warp transit 6 hours out from Velnerith. 3rd Strike Group was currently engaged in forward operations along the Nerith corridor's outer edge. I updated my maintenance request for the lighting panel in sublevel 4 to resolved, section reassigned. I made a fresh cup of the Terran analog beverage. It still tasted like regret. I drank all of it.